Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session, How to Connect the Open Science Framework to your ORCID. This session is part of the Research Transparency Campaign, whose goal is to increase awareness of pre-registration and other open research practices that are necessary to ensure transparency in the research workflow. This campaign is organized by the Erasmus Research Institute of Management with Lisette Guzman Ramirez, the Erasmus University Library with Nutalani Nadimi, and Erasmus Research Services with myself. My name is Antonio Schettino, and I'm Coordinator Open Science at Erasmus Research Services. Among the things that I do, I develop educational and training materials on open science for students, researchers, and support staff. Also, I directly support researchers in implementing open science in their workflow. So if you want to open up your projects, send me an email and I'll do my best to help. Also, please consider joining the Open Science Community Rotterdam, where researchers and support staff help each other in learning, discussing, and adopting open science practices. For more information, check out the website in the chat. In today's session, we'll talk about how to connect the Open Science Framework to your ORCID. And our invited speaker is Judith Gulpers. Judith is the faculty liaison librarian for philosophy and psychology, serving both the Erasmus School of Philosophy and the Erasmus School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And she's also the library's research intelligence officer and a key member of the Erasmus Library ORCID team. Before giving her the floor, just a few reminders. Please keep your microphone muted. Video is optional, so if you don't want to be recorded, please turn it off. And if you have questions, there are two ways to ask them. After the recording, click on after the talk, click on the raise hand button. We will give you the floor so that you can ask the question yourself, or write down your question in the chat. And after the talk, I will read it on your behalf. That's it from me. Judith, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. I'm going to share the screen. You should now see the PowerPoint presentation. So I first want to say thank you for giving us, as the Erasmus Library ORCID team, the opportunity to talk about ORCID again. Even if people don't join, I thought maybe they see the term ORCID in your agenda and then they think, hey, I have to do something with that. So thanks for that. I want to talk about how to connect your Open Science Framework account with ORCID, but when I was figuring out what's possible, I realized I have to take one step back and zoom out a bit to look at persistent identifiers in general, because that has consequences of how you can add your pre-registration and preprints that are in the Open Science Framework to your ORCID record. And if you already use your ORCID record to add journal articles or book chapters to your ORCID record, then you know there is a difference between publications that have your ORCID ID in the metadata, because then it's possible to auto-update, to give permission to, for example, Crossref to add your publications automatically. But you will also have publications that don't have your ORCID ID in the metadata, because maybe you add them to the Open Science Framework before connecting with ORCID. And then you have to add your pre-registration or preprint in a different way. And luckily, it's not manual typing, but there is some manual work involved. And ORCID calls that the search and link wizards that can be used for that. So about ORCID, you probably already know ORCID ID is a persistent identifier used for researchers. It's 16 digits long. And with that number, you also get your ORCID record, and that's where you can add everything related to your professional life. So the universities you worked, the grants you received, the publications like journal articles, data sets, preprints you published, peer review you've done, that can be added to your record. And all these pieces of information, they are hopefully all connected to other persistent identifiers. So that's the picture on the right side. You get a fund that has a persistent identifier like a grant ID. The funder has a fund ref ID. Then you are in the mid, you get it, you have an ORCID ID. You work at a university that has a WAR ID. And you have outputs, so a journal article, a book chapter, a data set, data management plan, and they all have their own persistent identifiers. And the most well-known is the DOI, the Digital Object Identifier. and that one is also used by Open Science Framework. But in the column on the left side, and now in, oh, sorry, now in, I want to say now in red, there are two different logos. The first one, the one on top, is the one from Crossref, and the second one is from DataCite. And due to the data types or the output types in the Open Science Framework, OSF has to work with both Crossref and DataCite. And that makes it a bit complicated when you look at getting data into ORCID. So we need both systems to get information into your ORCID record. So in the Open Science Framework, you will see ORCID a number of times, and they're not necessarily the same. You can use ORCID to sign up. So if you don't have an Open Science Framework account yet, you can use ORCID to create an account, but I think most people already have one, and then it's best to use the sign-in option, because then you can link your ORCID ID to your Open Science Framework account, and you have to authorize Open Science Framework, and that's an important extra step, but I will have screenshots for that later. There's also an option, maybe more visible, that allows you to manually enter your ORCID ID. So that really is typing the 16 digits. So there is room for errors there. But in all three cases, your ORCID ID will become visible on your profile page. And I had to write it down because otherwise I would forget to mention it. If you want to, you can also add your Open Science profile to your ORCID record, but you have to do that manually. And there is a websites and social links part in your ORCID record, which is a great place to do that. And you might also encounter ORCID ID when you want to endorse a preprint. These preprints have a applauded button, and you can only use that when you authorize through ORCID ID. But that's not connected really with your Open Science Framework account, but only limited to people with a ORCID ID. So this is what the screens look like. So the ORCID button is really prominent. The first one is if you don't have an account yet, then you can use ORCID to sign up. But if you use the sign in option for Open Science Framework, then you make the connection between the Open Science Framework and ORCID. And there is one important note. You have to use the same email address for both accounts. Otherwise, if you use a different email address for ORCID, then Open Science Framework will not recognize you and create a new Open Science account for you, which of course is a pity. So check your settings. Then I did that, and what you have to do is log in with your ORCID credentials, and then you get this screen. So you always have to, the first time, authorize Open Science Framework to get your ORCID ID. That means that they can go into the system, copy your ID, and then return it in their own system. So there's no, you cannot make a typo or another mistake. And if you authorize the access, then you will have to enter your email address. So this is where it's important to use the one you also use for the Open Science Framework. You will get an email from OSF to verify the email address so that they really know this is yours. And then your ORCID ID becomes visible in your profile settings as a connected identity. And that's also where you can revoke the authorization. So if you think, okay, I don't want this anymore, then it's possible to delete it at any time. The place to manually enter your ORCID ID. So that's not necessary once you made the authorization, but this is also a place where you encounter ORCID. Is under the profile information, and at the bottom you can see that the ORCID ID becomes part of your social links in OSF. I'm always thinking, why do they choose the term social? Because it's not very social ORCID. And what's also a bit strange is that they use a blue icon, which is not the color I associate with ORCID, which is mostly green, but that's a minor thing. So now what we've done is we've added the ORCID ID to your Open Science Framework account or profile. And that means that when you start publishing now, and it can be a pre-registration or a preprint or something else, your ORCID ID is part of the metadata of that publication. So if you have a pre-registration in Open Science Framework, as Antonio showed in his session, when you make the registration publicly available, then there is the option to mark create DOI, and that means a DOI is created for your pre-registration. But unfortunately, that's a content type that's not supported by Crossref, which is one of the main DOI registry agencies. So Open Science Framework has to register these DOIs via DataCite, a different organization. What's also important to note is that a pre-registration is not a work type in ORCID. ORCID has, I think, 20, maybe even more work types, so a journal article, a data management plan, a patent, but pre-registration isn't one of them, so you end up in the other section. That's one note, and the other note is that I see that sometimes only the creator is in the metadata of that is sent to ORCID, and then the contributors, which can be more than one, of course, are not included. So even if your ORCID ID is in the metadata, when you're the contributor, it might not be able to pick up that you are one of the owners or the creators of that pre-registration. So how do you get that pre-registration then in your ORCID record? When the ORCID ID is in the metadata, then you can give DataCite permission to use the auto-update for your ORCID record. And unfortunately, you have to give them permission in a system called DataCite profiles. We'll see print screen later. It looks like a lot of work, but you do it once and then you're good to go for also not only the Open Science Framework, but also for Figshare, for the data repository and other places where they use DataCite DOIs. When your ORCID ID is not in the metadata or in the contributor part, then there are different options. You can use the DataCite search and link wizard, and there is a claim DOI button then. There is the add DOI option, and you just search for the DOI and then it's being added. Unfortunately, you need a little bit of editing because the type of publication is a journal article, and then, I think that's not correct, technically speaking. And just for the sake of, to be complete, you can also use the OpenAir Explore search and link wizard. OpenAir is a technical infrastructure that supports open access in Europe, and they get data from all kinds of repositories. And I think it's a really great tool, but the disadvantage is you need another account and also to log in with that account. So I always forget it, and then I have to do a lot of extra work to make the connection. So I hardly use it. So this DataCite workflow, it all starts in your ORCID record. In the work section, you can click add to add something new, and then there is the search and link bar. And then DataCite is one of the options in the search and link wizard list. When you click that link, then you will have to, if you do this for the first time, you have to authorize their access. And then you end up in your DataCite profile page. And you can see this is mine. It shows your ORCID ID, the names that are in your ORCID profile, the organization also grabbed from your ORCID profile. And in my case, I have enabled the auto update. And if you haven't done that, then below ORCID permission will not say delete ORCID token, but say get ORCID token. And that's where you give DataCite permission to auto update from that moment. So that will help to automatically add publications you publish from now on in, for example, the Open Science Framework. To add publications that don't have your ORCID ID in the metadata, you can use the DataCite comments, and that's available when you click your name and then the comments page. And that looks like this. Antonio, I used one of your pre-registrations as an example. You can search in dataset comments by DOI or by title, and also by person, but it's sometimes a bit difficult to find what you're looking for. And when you click a title, then you get a page with all information, so you can see the creators and the abstract and everything. And at the bottom is the ORCID claim button. So when you click that one, sometimes it takes, you see program running, thinking, and then you claim your DOI, and all the information is sent to your ORCID record automatically. And unfortunately, you have to do this for all your pre-registrations one by one, but that you make the connection between the data sites, so that's really nice. So to make it a bit visual, I tested this, but I didn't add the publication to my ORCID record. So it looks like I did, but I didn't. And I think if we compare all the different options, I think the dataset comments is the best because it has the richest metadata, and also, yeah, unfortunately it says other because there's no pre-registration work type. If you use the add DOI but option, then you have to adjust the journal article. And for the open air, I think one of the I miss Open Science Framework in the description, but also the date is not correct. And I think for pre-registration might be useful to have the correct date and not January 1st added to everything. So my recommendation would be use the datasite comments option. So that's for pre-registration. Preprints have a bit of a different workflow. A DOI is generated through Crossref, so a different organization, and then your ORCID ID will be part of the metadata. And this is just to show an example that it's really part of the author field in the metadata of the preprint. So for preprints, OSF uses Crossref. That means that if you have already given permission to Crossref to auto-update, they will appear in your record automatically. If you haven't given Crossref permission, then unfortunately you have to wait till Crossref asks for your permission. So they will send a message once they find your ORCID ID in their metadata, and that can be for a journal article, a preprint, or something else. They will send a message through ORCID. Hey, we're Crossref and we want to have your permission to auto-update. So we really recommend say yes to that request because it saves a lot of time. For preprints without your ORCID ID in the metadata, you can use the Crossref metadata search and link wizard, but that definitely needs editing because here also the work type is a bit of an issue, which is strange because Crossref has preprint, ORCID has preprint, but it goes somewhere in the middle. It goes wrong. And also there is also, you can also use, of course, the add DOI option, and that needs also a bit editing, but less work. So how does that work? How does that look in real life? And these are really from real life. This is also a preprint from Antonio, and some of his co-authors added it to their ORCID record, but in different ways. So this is a great example of how it works in real life. In the first one, the Crossref auto-update was used. Okay, that looks great. In the second one, the Crossref metadata search was used, and you see that the date is missing, and also the type is there. And when the date is missing, then that publication is added to the bottom of your publication list in your ORCID record. So you think, where is it? You have to scroll to the end, and then you can find it. Of course, you can change this manually, but some extra work. And last one, I think Antonio used the add DOI option, and I think I tested it, and then somehow a journal article, a title, is part of the metadata, which is empty, but it has these brackets. You have to delete them to make it look nice. But for the rest, I think it's great way also to add the data. Maybe better than the Crossref metadata search in this case. So when using both Open Science Framework and ORCID, we have some recommendations. Make sure you authorize Open Science Framework, and the easiest way is to use the sign in option if you haven't done that, because then you can really make a connection and also have the link authorized. For pre-registration, the starting point is the search and link wizard of data sites, because then you can give datasite profiles permission to auto-update, and you can have the link to datasite's comments to add them manually. And for preprints, there is a different workflow, starting with Crossref, and yeah, you have to wait for Crossref to ask for your permission. So if you have a minute to spare, check if you can receive that request. There is in the notification setting of ORCID, there is a specific setting for when you want to receive requests from ORCID members to auto-update your record. And some researchers say, oh, I don't want emails from them. So it says never, but then this important email will also not reach your inbox. And if you have preprints you want to add that don't have your ORCID ID in the metadata, you can use the add DUI option. And in all cases, check the metadata, add it where necessary, especially I think the date and work type. These are the most important things to check. So that was the connection between Open Science Framework and ORCID. We have a monthly workshop. I wanted to say, if you want to join, there is one tomorrow, but the registration is already closed. But if you want to join, we can always add you manually.
Thank you very much. This was so clear. I have learned so much. And I think there are some things that I should go back to my ORCID record and fix. Also, thanks for the shout out for my work as a in my parallel life as a researcher. Yeah. Okay. So I don't see any questions in the chat. But you know that if you want, you can. Oh, Liz, yes, please.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Hi, Judith. Thank you for, that was an excellent talk. I also learned a lot. I was wondering if we wanted to, I mean, I don't know if you can answer this question, but assuming we now have OSF like gonna promote it more, is there a way that we could ask or somehow that we can say why the ORCID is not added in the metadata of preprints, or is there a way that we could edit the metadata of the preprint so that the ORCID is included and then it's connected automatically, or that has to come from their side completely?
Yeah, but if you make the connection between your Open Science Framework account and your ORCID ID, then for every new preprint, your ORCID ID will be in the metadata.
But sorry. I said preprint, but I meant pre-registration, because in the pre-registration is not in the metadata, right?
It is. I just didn't have a print screen. I think the main problem for the pre-registration is that you have a creator and a contributor, and that's where it sometimes goes wrong with sending the metadata to ORCID.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like it doesn't recognize that little piece of information.
Okay.
Or it might also be that so you know that you can, so when you create a pre-registration, you can add contributors, and maybe some contributors don't have their ORCID account linked to their OSF account. So it's possible that the system gives that information. It's just that the information is not there. I don't know. I have not tested this, so I can't say. Have you tested it?
No, but I've seen some examples where the ORCID ID was in the field, but not included in the but it's I think DataCite and started doing this last year in 2021, so maybe they're developing this. Yeah. I think I saw a question from Mutaleli, but I'm not sure if that was in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we give the question is, what's the difference between the workshops and personal support? We have the workshop is very general. So we talk about persistent identifiers and name disambiguation problems and how you can use your ORCID record and ID. And the personal support is really if someone says, hey, this is my record, where do I start? Or I have a problem with this, or how do I add this? So it's more on a personal level. And then we can look at a particular ORCID record together.
Yeah, perfect, thanks. So I think we're almost at the end. So I'm going to ask the question that I ask everybody. If you had to choose one open science practice that is necessary to ensure transparency, what would it be?
Yeah, I thought about it, and I think I was looking at my own work, and I work in the library, so I don't have any science activities. But if you want people to understand what you do and make sure that they can reproduce it, for me it starts with documenting what I've done and writing that up in a clear way. So for example, I try to add always a sheet in Excel with remarks. This is where the data comes from. This is what I've changed, etc. But that's not ORCID related.
That's okay, and I think it's a very good point. I mean, very often, people want to do the right thing and they want to put their information like that is useful to replicate the findings, or like to understand, how the project came about. But without documentation, it's really difficult to make sense of it. So I think it requires. I think you make a very, very good point. It's you need to invest time, and some time is required for documentation. But if you're a researcher working at the Erasmus University, you're not alone. There's a lot of people who can help you with this. So just, keep in touch. Okay, I think we are perfectly on time. So I'd like to thank you, Judith. Thank you very much for your very clear presentation. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us, and for all the events of the Research Transparency Campaign, which is basically ending. But hopefully you will join us for the final event, where you will see the link in the chat. Thank you all for your participation. Enjoy your day, and see you at the tomorrow. I think it's tomorrow. Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.